You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Talked about morality, ethics. Well, we've talked about ethics on the show before. We've even done a panel on just war, well, kind of on just war. We talked about just war. But is it important, morality and ethics in war? I mean, you kill your enemy, right? So there can't be anything surely morally more injurious than killing someone. But it happens in war, and we know that militaries invest a certain degree of their time in educating their people about, the rightness of their actions. But how does morality and ethics at war actually play out, and how does society get involved in terms of its responsibility to soldiers who conduct these morally sanctioned unmoral actions, or these ethically sanctioned unethical actions? I'm going to talk myself in circles here. So maybe it's just time to get into the show. G'day, listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. It is great to be back. We've had some cracker episodes lately, and we've had some peak download rates, so thanks very much for that. We've also had some great engagement on the Dead Prussian community, which is a social network specific, or as I like to say, bespoke, because it makes me sound hipster, bespoke to the podcast. That's right. If you are tired of hot takes on Twitter, if you are sick of your mum commenting on your theory of grand strategy on Facebook, how about you jump along to thedeadprussian.com, click on the community page and sign up. At the Dead Prussian community, we are a community of people who sit there on our computers, type away, and chat about things. We have a writers group, we have a study group, we have a readers group or a book club. We also have a Roman history club. I think I'm the only member of that club at the moment, but I'm having some great conversations with myself. Come and check it out. You can find all the details you need at www.thedeadprussian.com. All right, now in the intro, I talked myself into circles about ethics and morality, so I'm going to need to get myself out of the circles. Luckily, my guest today, a good friend of the show and just a good bloke around campus, knows a little bit about this. Actually, he knows a lot about this. My guest today is Dr. Deane Peter Baker. He was appointed to UNSW Canberra in August 2012. He came to Canberra from Annapolis, Maryland, that's in the USA for those people who don't know, where he was an assistant professor of ethics in the Department of Leadership, Ethics and Law at the United States Naval Academy for 2.5 years. And now we have a few guests that have worked in Annapolis and are currently there, so I'm sure there's a few listeners that know Deane. Prior to that, Deane was an associate professor of ethics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, where he taught for 11 years. His PhD in philosophy, don't worry, he does have a job though, was awarded by Macquarie University. Dr. Baker served briefly in the British Army. That's the best way to serve in the British Army from what I'm told, and served in the South African Army Reserve before resigning in 2009 with the rank of Major. He was convener of the South African Army Strategy Research Group and part of the leader group of the Umvoti Mounted Rifles, a reserve armoured cavalry regiment, but we won't hold that against him. A specialist in both the ethics of armed conflict and military strategy, Dr. Baker's research straddles philosophy, ethics, and security studies, pretty much all the topics we cover on the show. From 2006 to 2008, Deane was chairman of the Ethics Society of South Africa. He has held visiting fellowships at the Triangle Institute for Security Studies in North Carolina and the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College. From 2007 to 2010, Dr. Baker was editor of the African Security Review. Deane created the world's first massive open online course on the topic of military ethics. Now, a lot of listeners have probably heard about that. I think we talked about it a little bit in an interview with previous ethics guests, and it's on the Future Learn platform. In fact, I'm sure we have listeners out there who have gone through that course. In 2017, he was appointed to the International Panel for the Regulation of Autonomous Weapons, something we've talked about quite a bit on this show, and he is currently the co-director of the Future Operations Research Group at UNSW Canberra, my alma mater, our current employer, and located at the Australian Defence Force Academy. Deane, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. This is fantastic. I feel like I finally arrived. This is brilliant. Thank you.
Well, to be honest, I have been meaning to get you on the show for about 3 to 4 years.
But I kept slipping down the list. I
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah. And also, as most people who have been guests on the show or are still anticipated guests on the show, I am terrible at following up those initial conversations. Maybe I should get into a business like business development. Now, Deane, before we start discussing morality and ethics at war, I'm actually keen to hear about how you became interested in studying military ethics.
So yeah, you might think the answer is a bit obvious, because I spent a bit of time in the British Army, as you said, a short time, which is perhaps a good thing, and then I carried on studying and ended up with a PhD in philosophy. And so you might imagine that the obvious thing was to go, oh yeah, philosophy and the military ethics, those go together. But it actually took me quite a long time to work that out, and there's a little bit of a story behind what got me headed in that direction. When I was an undergraduate, I dated a girl who was a nurse, and I made the mistake of not checking out who her brothers were first, and discovered that she had 3 brothers. One was a semi-professional rugby player, big hulking bloke. One was less hulking, but I'm not quite sure what he did, but it was something shifty, and I think it involved possibly involved gun running. And the third brother was a former South African Defence Force reconnaissance commando who was at the time working for a company called Executive Outcomes, you may have heard of. And so I didn't really know much about this. So anyway, we broke up and I kind of forgot all about it. And then some years later, I turned on the TV and there was her eldest brother on TV being arrested for his role in an attempted coup in Equatorial Guinea. So you might remember the Wonga coup. So I was like, oh, this is really interesting. Maybe I could do something work-wise around this. And so that kind of started me going in the direction of military ethics. So the first focus was on mercenaries, or contracted combatants, as I prefer to call them. And it's just kind of rolled along from there.
It's quite an interesting connection to the Executive Outcomes botched coup. Very, very interesting as we see the rise once again of private military companies, and now I know you've done some interesting research on that. You've actually got a book on that as well. So listeners, I'll put a list of Deane's books in the a link to Deane's books in the show notes. Because it'll take us too long to go through each of his books here tonight. But you can find out a little bit more about private military companies and the ethics of their use by reading Deane's books. And you can find out lots of stuff by reading Deane's books, actually. You're also about to release a book now that we're on the topic of books, and that's how you do a masterful segue, ladies and gentlemen. Now that we're on the topic of books, you're about to release a book with Bloomsbury Academic, some people who keep my bookshelves bent. And this book's called Morality and Ethics at War, Bridging the Gaps Between the Soldier and the State. Can you give us a quick overview of the book? No spoilers.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me do that by kind of pulling that title apart. I think that's probably the easiest way for me to frame the book. So the first thing is I draw a distinction in the book between morality and ethics. And I don't always do that. I don't do that usually in my teaching because I think that can be confusing. But for the purpose of this book, I think it is important to have a distinction. So the kind of starting point is a recognition that there's a difference between morality and ethics. And I follow the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, not to be confused with the Liberian war criminal of the same name. And I follow him in saying this, that ethics is what it's good to do, while morality is what it's good to be. And I think that's a really important distinction in what I'm trying to unpack here. And what kind of moving along on the title, I'm really all about bridging the gap between a gap that I see existing between the individual, the soldier, and the state. And the soldier is the one who has a morality. So as an individual, you have a sense of what it is good to be. You have a moral identity, whereas the state doesn't have that. The state has ethics. It has rules. And I think that what we've overlooked so far in the scholarship is that there is a gap between the deep and rich individual morality of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, whoever that we have in uniform, and the kind of thin and very specific ethics of war that the state follows. So I think that gap is there, and what comes from that, I think, is moral injury. So this is a kind of an emerging concept, I suppose, with growing recognition. But I think that gap between the soldier and the state, between the morality of the soldier and the ethics of the state, is something we haven't bridged well enough. And I think we're ending up letting our people end up with moral injury when things go wrong. And that has an impact for the state on the other side, because we get strategic failure. When ethical failure happens, strategic failure often follows.
Right, that's interesting. Yeah, I like the to be or to do. That's how I've just translated it in my head, which is, I think, pretty close to what you said.
Yeah, close enough.
Because it's an interesting thing, and I also like that when you teach, you actually don't differentiate them, because as a student who's done an ethics course at university, sometimes it does get confusing, especially. In my case, the first time I delved deeply into military ethics was after I'd been to war. So, better late than never, they say, as I say. Now, in the book, you discuss moral frameworks and identity. How are these concepts important for military ethics?
Okay, so that's So I try to get my reader to imagine an actual bridge, right, or an actual gap that you might bridge. So you've got one bank on the left and the other bank on the right. And on the left is the individual, the individual who's a soldier, sailor, airman. And that's really where this idea of moral frameworks is so important. So, if I ask you, who are you? Well, the natural response is to say your name, but that's really just a label that helps us to say you're that one, not the other one. Or if I push a bit harder, you might say something like, you describe your work, you describe your family, and then we're starting to get a bit closer to the story. But really who you are ultimately is about what you value. And your identity is deeply and fundamentally a moral thing. It's all about what you count to be worthwhile or meaningful or valuable in that deep and rich sense. And that is, I think, foundational in this, because if we're to understand where the problem is coming, we need to have a clear grasp of what that framework looks like and how it works, because I think that's where the moral injuries are going to happen.
Right. So I would say, for those listeners out there, understanding that my identity is as the humblest podcast host, because I truly value my own humility, which I believe is the best form of humility in the world. I told that joke because I find that after listening to someone explain these concepts, I don't really have much value to add. So I'm just going to go to the next question about frameworks, about these frameworks and how frameworks of morality in war, I suppose, how that, and this is an important question, I guess, for those listeners that are trying to understand how we can ask soldiers to do certain things in war that, they just can't do when they walk down the street. And, apologies to all those totalitarian states and authoritarian state listeners I have out there, but this question is going to focus on what I believe is the the best of the bad lot, as Churchill would say, of forms of governance. How do these frameworks of morality in war connect with the ethics and morality of liberal democratic societies?
So this is really where, if you like, this is the other side of the gap. So where with the individual moral framework, that is going to be very specific to individuals. And part of what we want is for people to be able to work out for themselves what the meaningful, worthwhile, valuable life is. But on the other side, we've got the state, and the state is not individual. It's not, the values of the state are supposed to be in some sense objective, or maybe that's not quite the right term, but certainly something that's fixed and recognizable. But the challenge we have in the military ethics world is when we talk about military ethics, we rightly lean back into the just war tradition. But the just war tradition goes back a good 1,000 years, if not more. And it doesn't emerge out of the liberal democratic state at all. The liberal democratic state is a kind of newcomer on the international stage. So it's an important question. Can we connect up the foundations of the states that we live in to this way of thinking about the ethics of war? And I think that's really important. And I think one part of it, the answer is to think about the social contract. So what is it that legitimizes the state? What gives the state its right to use force? And ultimately that comes down to the social contract. The state exists because we've all agreed that we'll allow the state to exercise force on our behalf. That's a big part of the social contract. And so it's our rights that we pass over to the state, and that gives it a kind of legitimacy. So I think that's part of the answer. The other part is to look at what the foundational values are that underpin a liberal democracy, a liberal state. You know, what is it that makes this kind of way of thinking unique, and where does that come from? And I explore that in some detail in the book, and I won't go into too much detail now. But I think one of the key things that emerges from that is our view of the individual as a rights bearer, as someone worthy of respect. And so we've got these two things at work. There's the state's role to protect those under its care. It's a contractual relationship. It's a pragmatic thing in some ways. And then you've got this foundational idea of the rights of the individual. And I think we need both of those things. So within the scholarship on military ethics or just war tradition, we have an emerging group that have become labeled as the revisionist approach to the ethics of war. And I find them a little bit problematic because this is a bit of an oversimplification, but essentially what they're doing is they start with rights and they end with rights. That's the end of it, right? We're talking about the rights of the individuals, but if you follow that trajectory, we end up a lot of the time in what's sometimes called contingent pacifism. If all you have to do in thinking about the ethics of war is think about the rights of the individuals affected, in the end, you can't progress because that is such a demanding requirement. Something like collateral damage is just not possible. How do we justify an action that will cause harm to someone who is not a legitimate or who is not themselves the target? If it's all about rights, we just can't do it. And so we end up with a kind of pacifism. But if we think that wars need to be fought, that's an uncomfortable position to be in. So Michael Walzer, who's the sort of the dean of military ethics, I suppose, he responded to one of the revisionists by saying, essentially accusing him of treating war as if it was a peacetime activity. And in peacetime, we take rights as foundational, and that's sort of the only thing we think about. The state's job is to protect rights. Yeah. But there is this additional factor of protecting the group, of protecting the state as a whole. So I think that social contract and the focus on rights gives us a kind of a virtuous tension. And that is what fits comfortably, I think, within the more traditional view of the just war tradition. And it enables us to understand how it is possible to fight a war in which some people's rights, in fact, will be violated, because it's almost impossible to fight a war without there being collateral damage. But so we've got a way to cope with that, but without slipping over into some kind of unconstrained consequentialism where we do whatever we need to do to get to the end we want to get to.
It's interesting. You've talked about the rights and the impact on the rights. We've had some episodes recently. One talking about the rights of the others within society with Nicole Townsend, about what happens if you happen to be if you're a German living in Australia and the First or Second World War breaks out, or you're a Japanese person in the Second World War in Australia. We've had Catherine Bond on talking about how the law changes and the laws of the First World War, how they impacted and were written in a way that slowly removed rights from people. The oversight was a little bit different, laws being written in 15 minutes and signed off. And then I like that you brought up Michael Walzer, because, ladies and gentlemen, I now have a stake in this argument because I've read that book, Just and Unjust Wars, classic. And in fact, one of Deane's colleagues, Ned Dobos, taught me, and that was on the reading list. So I blame you, Ned. So it's quite interesting. You talked about, the idea between rights, and we're talking about the social contract, talk about the just war tradition, and we go back to St. Thomas Aquinas, but we know that from recorded history, we have it in Islamic jurisprudence. There's an element focusing on just war. We have it in Republican Rome. A lot of people who've, I'm sure there's a lot of listeners out here who are big fans of the original JC, Julius Caesar, and a lot of what he was doing was to avoid prosecution for what may have been an illegal war in Gaul. So if sometimes if you're called out on your unethical behaviour, maybe the opportunity will arise to just overthrow the democratic order of things. But let's not plan a coup tonight because it's late. Another thing you've talked about in the book, and this is something I like, I noticed that I've written morale rather than moral in my show notes, and I'm sure there's plenty of senior NCOs and junior NCOs out there who believe officers create morale pain. But what we're actually talking about is moral pain and moral injury. And it's a somewhat controversial topic regarding veteran support. I know there are some organisations out there that provide veteran support that tend to use the PTSD term to label everything. I know there's big discussions between diagnostic manuals versus the more ethical or ethics related discussions. So the psychologists and the ethicists probably line up pistols at dawn. We wouldn't do that though, because that's immoral. So how do moral injury and moral pain, how do these factor into morality and ethics in war? What are they, I suppose?
Right. So, I, as you say, this is a very debated topic, and this is just my attempt at trying to sketch it out. But I think so. We've had this. We've come to a point where we recognize and acknowledge PTSD, and that's taken a while, and that's a good thing. But what started to come out is that some of the people who are being who've been diagnosed with PTSD may have that, or they may have something else, or they may have two things. They might have PTSD, which is a kind of physical response to stress on the one hand, but there is this other aspect to many people's experiences of war, but of course it's not constrained to war, that seems to be a kind of damaging of them as moral beings. And so this ties back importantly into the idea of the moral framework as being definitional to us. Because if that's who I am, right? If who I am is in some sense these commitments and values that make up my identity, if I am involved in something in some way that shakes those, that hits those really hard, I can be damaged as my actual identity, who I am, can be damaged. So that's broadly the idea of moral injury. Now, I think I try to kind of clarify a few distinctions that help me in this book. So moral pain is, I think, something we all experience, and I think it's appropriate for us to experience moral pain. And I use the example of which I did a few years ago, visiting a concentration camp. In my case, it was Dachau. You go there and you look at what human beings have done to other human beings. And if you don't experience some kind of moral pain from that, there's probably something wrong with you, right? So we all experience moral pain when we see awful things and respond to it. And I want to distinguish that between that pain, which is normal and everyday, and injury. And I think injury is where we start to, in some way, not be fully functioning as moral beings. And I think you can see two different kinds of effects and so I call this moral trauma, the difference between pain on the one hand and trauma on the other. When we have trauma, I think we experience damage. And that damage can take two kinds of forms. And the one that's most recognizable to us is what I call moral dislocation. So again, if you imagine yourself as a kind of a framework, but you're confronted in this situation which knocks out one of those foundational pillars of who you are, that shifts who you are. Your identity gets dislocated. And so you may, for example, experience guilt to a way that's just doesn't really entirely fit the circumstances, and you may be able to be unable to move on from that. You may be overwhelmed by senses of guilt or remorse or something like that. That would be a kind of moral dislocation. But the other less recognized, but I think, and I get this from Ned Davos, so I should acknowledge him here, and I think this is really important. The other effect is moral numbing, and that's where we stop being able to experience the world in the moral terms that we should experience them. And this I'm really concerned about with the high operational tempo that we've had, particularly with special operations forces, that we send them time and time again, and you put them in these situations time and time again. And it can, I think, work kind of like, banging your fist on the wall over and over and again. Eventually, you're going to build up a kind of a callus, and you're going to stop feeling that. The feeling you should feel. And so this moral numbing is another kind of injury. It's less visible, but I think no less damaging.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And I guess for a lot of listeners out there, my understanding is that, the difference between PTSD and moral injury is one that I think a lot of people, as you said, try and make without sort of understanding them. But I've known people that had no problem with being involved in trauma. Whether they've caused it, killing or not. Their team have been received some horrific incidents, and their problem wasn't with the killing or the trauma they experienced, but it was the reasoning or the decisions made as to why they were in that situation in the first place. And so it's very interesting and difficult, I suppose, for a lot of these people who are so sure of themselves. Because, to be honest, people in the military are pretty confident, and they have to be. And even if they're not confident, they build themselves up to do some of the things they do. So it's quite a strike to the ego. I said ego. Now we're a psychologist podcast. We'll see how we go. But the idea of moral numbing also is fascinating, because you might consistently wear away at this moral fabric or this build this callus up, as you talk about, and then acts that would otherwise be considered immoral for this person prior to this numbing then becomes a new norm, I guess. So instead of going to war every now and then being the odd thing, it's actually coming home is the strange thing. Integrating the society. It's absolutely fascinating concept, Deane. And you talk about bridging the gap, and I think bridging the gap's a really good metaphor that a lot of people can understand. And it's about bridging the gap between, I suppose, the soldier or the guardians and other terms that you've used in the book, the guardian mindset, and the states on whose behalf they act, right? Because in liberal democracies, soldiers don't just go away, start wars. They're sent there, unless you're with executive outcomes, and then you get hired to start a war. And if you do it badly, you get arrested. But it is the flavour to discuss failed military coups at the moment, anyway. But how can liberal democratic societies because there's a challenge here, right? So how can they rise to the challenge of taking these people they train to be their defenders, their protectors, their guardians, and then they actually put them in morally treacherous or ethically diabolical situations?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, and I do try to suggest some ways of thinking about this. And I think the first thing is we have to ensure that we have the right foundation, as it were, on the left bank. So if we're looking at the individuals, have we got the right people? And some people are not the right people because they take themselves out of the picture, right? They're people who are whose moral frameworks are such that the idea of killing another human being is just not. They couldn't possibly fit that into their moral framework, and we don't actually see those people in the environment that we have today, because they just don't arrive at recruitment. But we did used to see them when we had conscription, because they would be your conscientious objectors.
Yeah.
But we're already excluding a whole bunch of people who are just not the right people to be putting into this kind of environment. But then there are the other people who may have moral frameworks that are just not compatible with the constraints that we think are important when it comes to war. We have to figure out ways to screen appropriately so that we have the right people in there in the first place. So I think that's the first part of it. The second part of that is giving them the right identity such that they're able to bridge. So coming back to this kind of, sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but part of my argument is that a liberal democracy, the key thing about a liberal democracy is that it's all about maximizing your ability to freely decide for yourself what kind of life is worthwhile, what things you value, and so on. And I think that is foundational. And so we have to respect that for those we recruit into the military. I'm always a little bit uncomfortable with character shaping as a kind of major effort for military forces. I know this is controversial, but I think character shaping can be about trying to change people's values. And I don't think that that's appropriate in a liberal democracy, except to the point where their values are just outside of what's possible within a liberal state. So I think what we need a kind of an identity that works as a bridge. Or it's not an identity, it's more of a way of thinking that works as a bridge that's compatible with the individual's deep, rich, and wide moral framework. They can grab hold of it and it fits in and it makes sense. But it also is appropriate to what the liberal democratic state does. And I think we've struggled with that a bit. And I talk about some of the alternatives that are out there. So, we talk about the warrior identity a lot. And I think that that's really problematic because a lot of the time what we're asking them to do is not carry out war. I think if we're using the warrior as the defining identity, I'm a warrior, right? What I do is I carry out war. Well, a lot of the time what we're doing with our armed servants is asking them to do things other than war and asking them to exercise restraint. So I'm uncomfortable with the warrior terminology. We also use the idea of a professional, which I think is better, but I also am not convinced by the idea of a professional simply because I think it's too small a notion. And if you think of the other professionals we have in society and what we expect of them, it's nothing like as much as what we expect. None of them are necessarily asked to sacrifice themselves. They have it's an important way of regulating knowledge and all of that kind of thing. But actually, I think there are other problems. So who's the professional? Are we only talking about officers? Are we talking about officers and NCOs? Is everybody a professional? Is the recruit who's just finished, entry-level training, is that person a professional? I just don't think it's a great fit. And so you mentioned earlier that I reach for this term guardian, and I think I grabbed this from Pauline Shanks in her book, Pauline Shanks-Curran, I should say, in her book, and she in turn gets it kind of a little bit from Plato, which I think is a good place to start. But it's this idea of, look, what are we here for? Well, we are the guardians of this state, but we're also the guardians of the values, the things that the state values, including the rights of others. So why don't we, torture people? Well, because we respect the individual rights of that person, even though they're the enemy. Yeah. But at the same time, we are able to go beyond just thinking about rights because we have this fundamental commitment or responsibility. We're exercising the state's responsibility to protect our people on their behalf. So I think that guardian thing is a much more useful kind of mental image. And I think if we can flesh that out and give it the content that we need, I think we're in a better situation. But of course, the other part of it is, and this is the bit that is often the hardest, is not sending them to do things that are not justified. And that's often where the problem comes in.
The use of the term guardian, I'm all for it. The term warrior, even just the term warfighter, is quite problematic. And, I know from my service history, it depends on who you are and what role you play depends on where you actually apply that term. Some people apply it to anyone wearing a uniform. Other people apply it only to the combat arms. But the idea of a warrior, if they're a warrior, then why are they out there doing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief? And you know what? I don't think society actually is going to be happy to pay for a state-of-the-art military that doesn't support humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, particularly in a country like ours at the moment, where the ADF's doing a cracking job supporting all kinds of natural disasters and pandemics at the moment. but it certainly is not war. And if anyone's going to question that one, please tune into the other show, War for Idiots, where I have an attack on this idea that there's a war on COVID-19. It's not about morality, but I've set off down this path. So go listen to that show so I don't keep talking about it. Listeners, we are going to have a quick pause so we can then do the bonus questions for subscribers. Now, subscribers are people who join the TDP community. So I talked about the community at the start of the show. The subscribers, that's who they are. I call them subscribers. When they join, I call them legends, actually. They get little badges on the website. It's really cool. Well, I think it's really cool. And there's at least a few people who think it's really cool because they've got the badges. So if you want to know the answer to the bonus questions, then check on the community, join it, and you'll hear the answer. And I'll tell you what, I'm looking forward to the answer to this question because I think this is probably one of the best questions I've asked for a bonus question. I'm not sure it'll be the best answer. No offense, Deane, but I've had some pretty good answers for bonus questions. But this is probably the one that this is a topic I'm quite passionate about. So I actually gave a fair amount of thought to this bonus question. So we'll have a quick pause. And we're back now with the cheapskates. The other listeners who don't pay money to listen to the bonus question. Now, Deane, that was a cracker of a question. And for those listeners out there who didn't hear it, I'm not going to tell you what it was, but let me just say Deane gave a brilliant answer, and I even quoted a Viscount, so it was quite exciting. But now it's time for the price, the final butcher's bill for the interview. Deane, my final question is one I ask of all guests, and it relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. I ask each guest to finish the sentence war is. So, I ask you, Deane, finish the sentence war is.
Well, seeing as I'm plugging an ethics book, I'm going to give an ethics answer. So here's my answer. War is sometimes the right thing to do, but only when we do it right.
Ooh, I like that one. I might put that one up to the students when I speak to them tomorrow about this. Or trainees. That's what you call military students. You call them trainees. That is excellent. And it's a very ethics based answer. Which you know what, I'd be disappointed if it wasn't. So I get enough ethicists on this show that I'm getting used to understanding their answers to that question, but I've never predicted any of their answers. So I'll probably need to get a few more ethicists on, or I'll just get you back for every book you've written. They'll probably fill out my show schedule for the rest of the year. Deane, thank you very much for coming on the show.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, please check out Deane's work. You can find his work on Amazon. If you type in Deane Peter Baker, don't write the word hyphen though, that would be a fail. He's got two first names, but I'll give you a list of some of his other works because I didn't cover them in the biography and I feel really, really bad. And Deane will make me pay for the coffee next time we catch up. So he's edited a work called Key Concepts in Military Ethics. Actually, I've got it sitting over here on the bookcase. Citizen Killings, Liberalism, State Policy and Moral Risk. Just Warriors Inc., as in Incorporated, The Ethics of Privatised Force. And then there's a heap of books about South Africa I'm not really going to go into because I'm not interested in South Africa that much, unless we're talking about the Angolan Wars. That's quite cool stuff. But there's a lot of books with Deane's name against it in Amazon. And also check out the latest book, the one that's been the topic for today or spurned and inspired the conversation, which is Morality and Ethics at War. And it'll be out very, very soon from Bloomsbury Academic, and you can check the link on the show notes to pre-order that book. Also, please follow Deane on Twitter. He's great at conversing on Twitter, and the people involved in the Future Operations Research Group do quite a bit of tweeting, and there's some great conversations happening there. So he's at DPB Ethics, and that's on Twitter. So make sure you follow him, have a good chat. I'll probably mention the TDP Community Subscribers Network too much tonight. So please just give it a crack, see if you like it. If you don't like it, you can just leave. And that's fine. That's like those people who don't like the show. You don't need to leave me a 1-star review and nasty comments. Just don't write anything. Do the moral thing and give me 5 stars. All right. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.